Throughout history, humans have had one thing in common: always want to kill each other. I'm Brennan Rushton, and this is Theaters of War. Welcome back to this week's episode of Theaters of War. Today we have a little bit more of a unique perspective on warfare. Now, before we talked about the direct theaters, that being the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the intelligence, all these were used to directly combat the enemy in combat and to essentially gain a victory through superior means of weaponry, tactics, and other forms of military conflict. But this is a very different one. We're going to be focusing more on the behind the scenes, the mental aspects of war, the battle that happens not on a battlefield, but most commonly over the radio, on posters, and of course in the minds of allies and enemies alike. Today we are going to be talking about the concept of psychological warfare. So, what exactly is psychological warfare? Now, it's gone by a few terms in the past. There are many military operations today that have entire bureaus and divisions and sections of their military dedicated to this practice of psychological warfare. It's been described as military information support operations, political warfare, winning hearts and minds, and propaganda. The term is used, quote, to denote any action which is practiced mainly by psychological methods with the aim of evoking a planned psychological reaction in other people. Now, as we can see on the screen now, which will return shortly, psychological warfare has evolved quite drastically over the years. At first, its main purpose was mostly just to get information. You capture an enemy, you bring them to your torture chamber, your dungeon, you try to extract information out of them. That is the main function for much of its history, at least in the less civilized era of human history. There are a few other things that psychological warfare has done. Of course, it has the effect of reinforcing behaviors and attitudes in people and essentially changing the mindset of people. Now, this could be used either on allies or the citizen population or the enemy. For instance, propaganda boasting your own military achievements while degrading an enemy's does the effect of making your force seem much stronger, much more effective, and more competent than the enemy, creating a psychological difference in terms of how innocent people not directly involved in the conflict, actually perceive the conflict and the people involved. It is also used to destroy the morale of enemies through tactics that aim to depress troops' psychological needs. So, that's the basic overview of the psychological warfare, but let's get into some specifics. In early history of psychological warfare, there are many societies that employed quite extreme and sophisticated tactics, though cruel they were, such as the Romans. The Romans were very much known for their specific and almost draconian tactics at combat. In this era, many militaries were simple. They were direct. There was honor, and there was almost a play at fighting. People would kill and pillage here and there, but nobody really went to total war. And that's where the Romans changed things with their multitude of different actions that they committed. With their small unit tactics, they would confuse the enemy. They would deceive the enemy. They would flank the enemy in a pronged attack. They would murder and brutally destroy villages in order to subjugate other villages, creating this psychological effect that if we don't surrender, we will be destroyed, thus bring them into the fold of the Roman Empire and ever growing. Now, this is a tactic that's been used since then and is still used nowadays. Fear is an effective motivator if you're trying to invoke essentially a quick surrender or a change of heart, which we'll get to soon. But I think one of the main intense and explosion of psychological warfare that really captivates what we think of when we think of psychological warfare was World War I. And we had many, as I said, aspects in the past, but when World War I hit, this was a modern age. This was the age of the radio, of the war poster, of the politicians yelling at a desk or on the radio or in Parliament. This was the age of personalities and the age of nationalism. Countries were so united by their national identities that people actually resonated with their military and political leaders. People looked to their kings, their queens, their country, and propaganda posters were made in order to invoke a sense of patriotism and a sense of winning, of a sense of superiority on the battlefield, while demonizing the enemy. A famous propaganda poster, of course, is Britain's "We Want You," and Germany being sort of seen as this brute battling through Belgium. And this was used on both sides, Germany and Britain, more specifically those two than these other countries. They were in a very heated propaganda war. And the military knew this. They knew the power of speech, especially with their leaflet campaign, which we're seeing now. Over a dozen operations happened, which would drop leaflets all over Germany and all over Europe to essentially invoke a feeling of wanting to surrender, giving peaceful protesting to the warfare that was happening. Now, this didn't just stick to posters and diplomacy. This did make it onto the battlefield itself. Like the Romans before with their small unit tactics, their dividing and conquering, and their brutal subjugation of small villages and countries, the Germans, they invented a new type of warfare that would invoke the same fear and the same brutality as the Romans, and that was the advent of gas warfare. Now, to give the Germans credit, they weren't the first to use gas weapons. That was actually the French, which they used tear gas, which was not outlawed. However, Germany was the first to use illegal gas warfare. When this gas warfare was used, it essentially created a lose-lose situation. You create this intense feeling of fear, but then that only makes the enemies want to retaliate more. It can have the opposite effect in making them demonize you even further, which is what happened. Germany tried many of these tactics. The Zeppelin raids as well were another form of psychological warfare in order to break the spirit of the British people, to break them at home. And yet all it does was it brought people together. It created more enemies in Germany. It had the adverse effect, not the intended effect, of course. Now, with all these tactics in World War I, it would definitely, as you more than likely assume, would explode with the rise of extremism in World War II. In the interwar period, it was a bit quiet as the societies such as the Soviet Union, Germany, Italy, Japan, even the Western Allies were settling into the new age of things. And in World War II, we had the explosion of propaganda, political propaganda to be specific, especially from Germany. A certain Joseph Goebbels was a propaganda master and would pump out films, radio transmissions, posters, even things such as billboards and advertisements were forms of propaganda. Even their money was propaganda. It was insane that the people were being fed so much information from the state that they didn't even know that they were consuming. And this created this intense feeling of superiority, but also a feeling of almost this world conspiracy that everyone was against them and the Germans had each other. It was almost the greatest betrayal of their own people that they caused this much mayhem, this much mental brainwashing, there's no real better way of saying it, to the German people, which of course led to some of the most atrocious, and extreme acts, not just in Germany, but also in the Soviet Union, which was, again, a huge propaganda machine. But we will get into specifics very soon. One of the most, I say overlooked, but maybe that's not the correct word, maybe understated aspects of propaganda and as well as psychological warfare was in the Cold War. The Cold War was an explosion of propaganda with the West and the East fighting against each other. Political tensions were higher than ever. The ideologies of the Western capitalist philosophy and the Eastern communist Marxist philosophy were in full swing. They were making movies. They were making radio plays and radio transmissions. They were making literature to spread their messages, either to fight communism, American imperialism, and to invoke a sense of cultural diplomacy onto smaller nations. Now, the US and the Soviet Union are known for this with their cultural explosion through music, art, education, all in an attempt to counter Soviet influence. Now, of course, just like with World War I and just like with World War II, there were covert operations that were happening. The CIA and the KGB engaged in secret operations designed to influence foreign populations, undermine political opponents, brainwash people, scare them with psychological manipulation, and other forms of extreme psychological warfare. And lastly, there was a not directly psychological, but indirectly had a similar effect, and that was the Marshall Plan. After World War II, Europe was devastated. Destruction reigned all over the continent, and the US decided with the Marshall Plan to fuel the economic engine of West Europe, essentially bringing them back to a standard of living that was pre-war or surpassed it. Now, this was directly, or at least on paper, designed only to economically support their allies, but it was also a combative measure to the Soviet Union and communism, as if these countries fell to economic disarray, they would be more prone to extreme ideology. And that's sort of the basic overview of propaganda. I want to get into some specifics, but we'll save that for the second segment. All right, psychological warfare, it's taken many forms. It's destroyed the spirit of many enemies, and we have some examples for you. Now, I mentioned the Romans. They're sort of the pioneers of the early total war era of psychological warfare, but we have another great emperor in the world, another emperor who conquered most of their continent, Genghis Khan, who was an infamous user of psychological warfare in order to deceive and counter his enemies. He would use subtle tactics, but effective ones. He would try to defeat the will of the enemy, and one of his most famous tactics was to have each of his horsemen carry 3 torches. Now, this would essentially make it look like his army was 3 times the size that it normally was. And like the Romans before him, he would invoke the same tactics of destroying villages, subjugating villages due to the fear of them being destroyed, and so on and so forth. But Genghis Khan was extremely prolific in this subtle warfare, and there are a lot of other great leaders that have employed a similar sort of psychological undermining of enemies. Alexander the Great would curry favor with supporters and force soldiers to stay behind in conquered cities. This would allow them to reproduce with the local population and essentially stamp out any national identity that they had prior to Alexander the Great showing up. And there was, centuries of this for, from the Romans to the Middle Ages, Genghis Khan, and even the Victorian and the American age. But again, an era I want to focus on a lot is World War I, because I think this is where it really modernized the aspect of psychological warfare. At the start of the war, as I mentioned before, it was mostly Germans and the British using propaganda to demonize the enemy. They would use this domestically to inspire their own troops and their own population, and obviously foreignly to use it against the enemy. The Germans were referred to as the Hun, which is a term that refers to the Central Asian ethnic group that moved into Europe, I believe in the 11th century, in the middle of the middle of the 2,000-year period between the Romans and now. Now, this was obviously not true, as the Germans were not ethnically Hun, but it was a way of essentially demonizing their actions in Belgium as a marauding force of raiders that just come and burn and pillage everything in their path. And this was broadcasted over the world. The British would have their insane influence over the entirety of the world, their colonies in North America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and they would broadcast this and essentially change the perspective that Germany was the bad guy. Not to discredit or to give any justification to actions given to both sides, but it goes to show that perspectives can change based on global influence. The British were also fond of their covert operations. One of their most famous was a certain individual in the desert of the Middle East, and that was Lawrence of Arabia. The British sent him there in order to inspire the local Arabian population to rise up against the Ottoman Empire and install a more ethnically homogeneous nation in the Middle East. Now, the British did not give these promises that they were promising the Arab population, but it had an effective resolution, and that the Ottoman Empire was destabilized, and they were able to easily attack the Ottomans from Egypt, and it allowed their forces to enter much easier. Now, as I mentioned, Germany did employ gas weaponry in order to easily gain positions on the front, to psychologically, mentally scar the enemy with shell shock and other forms of psychological disabilities and psychological conditions. And of course, ever since the start of the war, artillery barrage was used in the same vein in order to barrage the enemy for hours at a time, leaving them like rats hiding in their trenches under the constant fear of death and collapse. The Germans also did one important task, one important operation that would forever change human history, and that was the sending of Vladimir Lenin back to Russia in order to instigate a revolution. Now, this would forever change the 20th century and lead Russia down a path of Marxist ideology, and in doing so would knock them out of the war, but it would be in vain, as Germany would not be able to finish the fight against the West and would eventually surrender. But in doing so, this led to Lenin later, after the Bolshevik Revolution had taken place, take power of Russia, change it into the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Republics, and begin their own propaganda in World War II. Now, World War II has a huge array of political and ethnic propaganda, as you probably know. The Germans, of course, were the big ones in this category. They had these marching death squads that would march behind the main lines and would take care of any undesirables that the Germans thought of. This would be Jews, this would be Romas, this would be Slovakians, Slovaks, this would be Russians, a whole host of ethnic and religious groups. In doing so, this would break the spirit of the enemy, of course, and it would demonize the enemy, who weren't even fighting them at this point, mostly just civilians, some soldiers, but again, civilians were mostly the target here. And I don't really have to go into too much detail on the concentration camps of World War II, but yet another way of psychologically boasting their own ideology of this Aryan German supremacy, while demonizing and essentially destroying another ethnic group, that being the aforementioned Jews, Romas, and other groups. As I mentioned, Joseph Goebbels was a master propagandist, and he would pump out hundreds of films, posters, radio broadcasts, and as I said, even advertisements, even cars, everything was a subtle symbol of German supremacy and ethnic hierarchy that he was promoting. This was similarly broadcasted to the Soviet Union or similarly acted in the Soviet Union, but far less extreme. They didn't have as much of an ethnic angle to their propaganda, but they did have an extreme sense of economic view of that, where obviously, as you can probably imagine, being that they are a follower of the Marxist doctrine, they do not take kindly to the wealthy capitalist elite. And so their propaganda more so brings a sense of clarity and equalness to their people. Stalin was portrayed as an even man to the average Soviet citizen. He was walking amongst the people, carrying babies, and essentially acting like a superhero. Of course, this wasn't the reality of the situation, but it was a way of sort of pushing that Marxist ideology that everyone under the system is equal. And this would, of course, spread to the West, where the West would demonize both the Germans for their insane nationality, their insane ideology, and their extreme pushing of borders and their extreme brutality on the front. And would also attack the Japanese for their extremist views. Specifically, the Japanese in their POW camps were probably some of the worst military-adjacent military camps in the war, not including civilian camps such as Auschwitz and Dachau and such. But these Japanese POW camps were extremely brutal on the population. Many of the American, British, Australian soldiers would be starved. You could see that their bones were peeking through their skin. They were demoralized. They were humiliated every day, doing horrible, extremely dangerous, and extremely difficult, hard labor tasks. Seems like everybody in World War II was getting in on the propaganda pie and the psychological warfare pie, but it wouldn't stop there. As we head into the Cold War, there is one specific part of the Cold War that I wanted to discuss, and that was MK Ultra, which was this extremely secret, extremely illegal operation that America was committing during the Cold War. Now, the MK Ultra project was a project created by the CIA, which would essentially use drugs and procedures to try to alter human behavior and the human mind. It was used in order to try to create sleeper agents, super soldiers, and other extreme soldiers, I guess, for the Cold War. Now, a couple of these experiments would be using chemicals on subjects' brains. They would use drugs like LSD in very high dosage. They would use electroshock therapy, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and other forms of torture. Now, how did this happen? This is an extremely illegal, extremely unethical practice used in the Cold War. But there was a specific origin of this, and that, of course, brings us back to the Germans. As in 1940, the writing was on the wall. The Germans knew they were going to leave, or they were going to have to leave the war on the losing side. So many of these scientists that were stationed at camps like Auschwitz and Dachau during World War II, who conducted these interrogation experiments on human subjects and used substances and drugs and other forms of hallucinogenic drugs and hallucinogenic tactics would be employed by not only the Americans, mostly the Americans, but also the Soviet Union, in order to employ those tactics for their own scientific sector, which would try to create their own super soldiers, their own interrogation techniques, and create a sense of paranoia. MK Ultra was one of the most shameful aspects, the shameful operations done by the United States, as it was one of the most brutal and one of the most extreme things the United States has ever done in their military history. And that's saying a lot, considering that the United States ain't exactly a clean slate of a country. But the Cold War was also, on the civilian front, it had an extreme sense of civilian paranoia. The Red Terror, the capitalist West, both populations, they saw each other as ideological enemies, not in warfare, but in culture. This would be invoked in movies, be invoked in literature, and it would create this this us versus them mentality that is, if I'm being honest, is seen in today's society as well. It seems that has carried over, that ideologies are boiled down and people are boiled down to a single idea that can't be separated. And that's about all for the Cold War and some of the most significant aspects of psychological warfare. And we'll see you in the third segment, Theater of Thoughts. So, psychological warfare, a couple things to mention here. Again, it's not always a direct conflict thing. It's not something that is directly used on an enemy in combat, such as tanks, such as guns, Molotovs, examples, but it's something that's used beyond the battlefield in order to attack the root of the issue. Like we mentioned, the Zeppelin raids didn't attack military targets, it attacked civilian targets. This idea of subjugating these villages, burning them to smithereens and killing everybody wasn't to attack their military force, but to force other civilian populations to surrender. The propaganda used in Germany in order to turn them into these superior Aryan people was not used to demonize or even to attack the enemy forces in the West and the Soviet Union. It was used to prop up their own ideology while bringing down another. And of course, MK Ultra wasn't a direct attack on the Soviet Union. In fact, it used a lot of American citizens in its experiments as well. And it was used outside of warfare. The entirety of the Cold War is a great example of this. Very little fighting happened, but a lot of fighting happened under the hood. And I think that's all we have for today. We hope to see you next week, where Tyler will be talking about more theaters of war.